right? Yeah.
Okay, I'll shut the doors and then you'll see them, okay?
Cool. Yeah, sounds great.
Okay.
Do you want to be visible the whole time? Or
I
just
started the
talk?
camera.
What order are we talking?
Do you want your face visible the whole time or just when you're talking?
No, I just want to talk.
Okay. He doesn't want to be shown when he's not talking. I don't know how you do that.
I don't need to be like a big disembodied head that just chills there the whole time.
Yeah. Okay, so no one can see you now.
Okay.
Okay, good morning everybody. Hi. Great that you made it. Sunday morning 9 o'clock. Welcome to the panel on Terrorization of Dissent, Corporate Repression, Legal Corruption and the Enterprise Terrorism Act. We have three speakers, Carol, Anthony and Michael, who's stepping in. Thus, unfortunately also couldn't make it. And yeah, I guess we start with Carol. So Carol Gasser is an assistant professor of sociology at Minnesota State University in Manhattan. She's also a long-time animal rights activist and she currently focuses on ending animal exploitation and animal experimentation of intersection with the group Purpose for Science. In her academic work, she addresses social movements and intersections of non-human and human animal exploitation. She will talk about this law, the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act, what it is and why it matters. So I'm just going to provide a brief introduction to the law for anyone who doesn't know what it is, and then I'm going to hand it over to people who have chapters in the book. What is the official title of the book, I think?
Terrorization of Dissent.
Terrorization of Dissent, and it's a really great book because it's got a lot of different chapters, and then one of the cool things I got to do was to just facilitate writing letters to do an interview with a political prisoner. So the book is full of great analysis from all different voices as well as interviews with people who have been affected by the law. So I don't think it's for sale here, but it's a good book. So who has heard of the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act before? Pretty most people. Who feels like they know what it's about? Most people? Okay, so if I say something wrong, correct me. But some of you aren't quite sure of it, so I will go ahead and do just a really quick breakdown of it. So I had the text of it up, but it's fine because it's really long. You can look it up if you want to. But the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act is a bill that was signed into U.S. law on November 7th, 2006. And actually, can someone be my assistant and pass some things out? Cool. We're not going to talk about this quite yet, but this will be useful. I'm really on the ball today. Is that specious? On the ball? Does that have to refer to animals? I don't know. I'm sure it is. I'm sure it's awful. So this, what's important about this law, and there's a lot of things important about the law in and of itself, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but what's important about how the law got passed is that it didn't pass through normal legal procedures. So there was originally a law called the Animal Enterprise Protection Act, which was stemming from a farm bill. So there's a long history of this law being consistently amended. There were a lot of shady committee hearings along the way. A lot of committee hearings were set up in order to sort of start getting language in that would make us used to words like animal enterprise. The way the law was passed, when it was amended from the Animal Enterprise Protection Act to the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act, is also pretty shady. So when there's bipartisan support for something in Congress, you can sometimes vote on it without a full hearing. And what happened on Martin Luther King Jr. Day, while everyone in Congress was busy outside celebrating one of our civil rights heroes, a few people were sitting
in some austere building somewhere passing this law through, and most people in Congress didn't even know that it was being passed through that day. So what this law says is that it provides sentencing guidelines for causing physical damage of more than $10,000 or causing bodily injury or even fear of bodily injury to an animal enterprise, so anything that makes money off of non-human animals, the operations of an animal enterprise, or any people or the property of people somehow related or involved with an animal enterprise. So this, some of this was already in the Animal Enterprise Protection Act, the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act sort of ratcheted this up. So why is this bad? And what's problematic about it? And what's different about it in other laws? First, it punishes ideology. So if you commit a crime and it's not against an animal enterprise, you will have a lesser sentence than if you commit this crime against an animal enterprise. And I'm using their language here very uncomfortably. But in this way, it punishes ideology. We have a history of that in our country. We accept punishing ideology. Sometimes liberals even support it. So we support things like hate crime laws. So the idea that if you do something illegal and it's for a specific ideology, then it gets a harsher punishment. The problem with these laws is that when we let people in power who tend not to look like the masses be in charge of being thought police, deciding which ideas get harsher sentences. And that's what's happened here. They decided the idea that someone would do something motivated by protecting the earth or non-human animals is punishable with now a terrorism charge. That's the second problem, is that now we have the word terrorism in there. So before we had the Animal Enterprise Protection Act, and now they've worked this word terrorism in. So now they can increase punishment, and rhetorically, they're demonizing these actions in a harsher way. This not only protects animal enterprises, but it targets all animal activists. So this rhetoric since 9/11 has been in our country, and it's been in the way we talk about activism, but now it's codified into law. And so it becomes much easier, even in small court cases where you're talking about activists being charged with things like trespassing, which is a normal tool used against legal activists all the time. Now it's very easy to slip in the word terrorism in all cases when we're talking about animal and earth liberationists. Next, the sentencing guidelines are extreme. So you take things that are already punishable by law, and now you give them much harsher penalties, much longer time. When you sentence someone as a terrorist, you can have much harsher penalties, right? Because as a society, we don't agree with terrorism. Next, the sentencing guidelines are focused on causing economic damage. So when we think of laws, we think of laws to protect people, but it's very, very clear in the language of this law that it is to protect property. And non-human animals are seen as property. So if you can convince a judge or a jury that you've lost up to $10,000 in revenues because of an action of an animal rights activist, then they can be charged under this law. And that's actually quite easy to do. So if an animal is released, a dollar's amount is placed on that animal's head. If you decide to buy security cameras and your security camera system costs $5,000, even though it's your decision to buy it, that ups the charges. So it's very easy to slip people into these charges. And because of all these reasons, the big issue is that the law is chilling. The breadth of what is hypothetically prosecutable is immense. It's hard to even imagine, but as activists, we become police in our own heads and we start imagining the worst things possible. Causing physical damage, what exactly does that mean, right? Damage or interference with the operations of an animal enterprise. So we start thinking things like, well, if we have an effective protest and people aren't walking into a building to buy fur coats, well, aren't we interfering with operations? And this is intentional in the law, to make activists start thinking like that, to make activists start policing ourselves, to chill our First Amendment rights, and to have us police our own First Amendment speech and our own First Amendment activity. They say things like, if you cause reasonable fear for anyone related to an animal enterprise, then you're prosecutable under this law. So this is a very vague language, and it's overbroad. This combined with the prosecutions that have occurred under the law lead it to be a very chilling law. So we have people charged under the Animal Enterprise Protection Act, the precursor to the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act, the SHAC 7. Have you heard of this case? They were charged, they weren't found to have actually done anything illegal, but they were said to have incited illegal action. So successful, legal, above ground activists have been so effective that now we've prosecuted people because they were effective above ground legal activists. The AIDA 4 case, college students doing home demos printed an address on a flyer so people would know where to meet up, and now they're being charged under terrorist charges. But importantly, that didn't go through, right? And then, do you have a picture of, there's currently a case with 2 people, Kevin Olaf, that's Tyler Lang right there, and they're being charged with having, the charges against them, they're being accused of having released mink from a mink farm, and they're being charged under the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act for, they haven't been found guilty of it, but for allegedly releasing mink from a mink farm. So I think any common person, people who like animal activists or not, would think that Tyler loves animals, even if he did release mink from a mink farm. That does not seem like an act of terrorism, right? But that's what this law is doing. And in that way, this law becomes overbroad and chilling. What I've given you here is just for people who are interested in the history. This is just like, this is all from something that I wrote, but I thought that they would be interesting to look at. So this is just kind of a history of repressive laws and actions and cases that have occurred leading up to the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act and things that have happened after. And I sort of stopped in 2010 because that's where my research stopped, and so sorry, I know time has passed. And then I want to point out that we really have had a chilling effect. So even though few people have been prosecuted under this law, it has drastically changed the way radical and activists and people who engage in illegal direct actions behave. So on the back side is a chart that I put together that just shows illegal actions for which people submitted communiques, so people admitted to them and tried to publicize them. So I just tracked them over time from 1990 to 2010, and you see in 2006, where this law was enacted, you see leading up to this law, all sorts of illegal actions, ones that are more contentious like arsons, ones that are more supported like animal liberations, they are all declining. And then you see what happens in 2006. It just kind of, I mean, maybe people just don't talk about them as much anymore and they don't issue communiques because of these laws. I don't know what the cause is, but definitely something big and something drastic has happened. So whether or not they're prosecuting people under the law, it has definitely had a super, super chilling effect. One thing I would like to say about this before I turn it over to other people is that this is a serious law and we need to take it seriously, but the worst thing that any activist can do is to have it actually repress their activism. So this is only chilling because we listen to power and we let power win. So the number one thing we have to do is take people like Tyler. Tyler is very near and dear to my heart. We became activists at the same time. I looked up to him. He's a bit younger than me, but I look up to him as someone who helped me become an activist, helped me find my voice, helped me stand up for others who needed my help. And now, because he's a powerful person in that way, because he's inspiring, because he does not let himself get repressed, he is being repressed. And the number one thing we can do is support people like this and support them. I recently saw him and he told me the only thing he's really scared about with going to jail is that other people won't do activism if he goes to jail. That's his biggest fear. He plans to go get out and keep being a wonderful human being that's doing things for others who need his help. So the number one thing we have to do to combat this law is to not be chilled. Some people in this audience are academics, and some of us have a doctor in front of our name. And it's particularly important that people like us, since we're just handed, whether it's just or not, we're just handed a platform where people sometimes shut up and listen to us. So it's really important that we use that platform to say important things about laws like this, to speak up against it, to not be so scared about whether we get tenure or whether our department doesn't like us, and to write about these issues and to talk about these issues and to be open about them. And it's important that we all show that we're also willing to be activists and to go out into the street and to do the sorts of things that people are trying to be silenced from doing. Basic First Amendment protest activity is what's being silenced with this law. They're not actually silencing scary, dangerous, illegal actions. They're silencing all of us from using our voices. So the number one thing we have to do is take it seriously, but not let it stop what we're doing, and think about all the areas where we have privilege, where we can step outside of our comfort zone and advocate on behalf of others in the face of this law so that it doesn't repress us. So you're going to hear other speakers speak more directly about specific things having to do with this law. And before they go into it, I don't want it to have a chilling effect for us, so just remember, repression means, and does anyone study social movements? Or you know about one or two other ones? Repression always happens when we're about to win, right? So repression means we're having an effect. So don't let repression do what it's trying to do. Don't back down. Don't act out of fear. It's okay to get angry, get active, take this seriously, know about this stuff, but instead of using it as a center of fear inside of you, use it as the fire that fuels you, that makes you angry, and propels you to keep fighting for non-human animals.
Thank you so much, Carol. And we're now introducing Michael Lowenthal. He's a multi-site adjunct and he teaches courses focusing on terrorism, political violence, and conflict resolution at Georgetown University, George Mason University, and he also teaches political theory at a maximum security men's prison, Jessup Norwegian Institute. Yeah. Hi, Michael. And you will talk about eco-terrorism, the current state of the Green Scare, and the criminalization of dissent. You're on, Michael.
Oh, okay. I wasn't able to tell. Can you be able to hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. So I want to start a timer so I actually know how long I'm talking for. I didn't actually hear the intro, which is kind of what threw me off. Just give me 1 second. Okay. So what I want to do today is I want to kind of give context to the chapter I wrote, and then since it's a panel constituted based on a book concept, I figured I would read some of the book, some of the chapter, which is something I've actually never done before. Not that I haven't read the book, but I've never given a presentation based on kind of reading from the book. But so I want to kind of give the methodological and kind of intent background. How many people in the room are in academics or doing academic work? Okay, so that's what I kind of figured. Okay, so the work the chapter is based on was done as part of my master's research. And one of the things that maybe is most interesting in the discussion phase is talking about IRB and some of the consent issues, but putting that aside for a second, what I attempted to do was I wanted to develop a data set that activists could work with that we could use to make arguments of a social movement, largely sociological nature. So when I surveyed the kind of literature out there on what sort of studies had been done on the animal liberation front, the earth liberation front, and kind of this broad collectivity defined, very problematically, but defined by the state as eco-terrorists, right? Each kind of range of actors. What I found, there was about 5 or 6, well-reviewed, peer-reviewed, well-published papers, and of those papers, none of them had a transparent methodology or a transparent data set. So they would all talk about the ALF or the ELF or eco-terrorism at large, and they would do so without explaining in any way kind of where those findings were generated from, right? What this kind of data set was. So I said that, well, this obviously can't be by accident. This seems intentional. And for people who have kind of surfed and familiarized themselves with the ephemera of animal liberationists and earth liberationists, whether it's sites like DirectAction.info, the Bite Back magazine, or sites like the North American Animal Liberation Press Office, one of the things this movement's really good at is chronicling its own actions. right? All the way back to like Archangel magazine in the 70s in Britain, these magazines keep slaughterhouse. So when I started to look for tried to look for this data and I realized it wasn't there, I figured I would do it. So I engaged in, I guess it took about 3 or 4 months, and I built a data set that began with the first recorded incident with the Band of Mercy that was in 1972, and went up until I stopped collecting data, which was in early 2011. And I looked at all nations of the world. I looked anywhere at a set of criteria. I developed this tree that said, if this, then this. And basically, if the act was carried out by a subnational clandestine group, I don't have the exact wording in front of me, but something that was employing political violence, that was constituted as anywhere ranging from misdemeanor vandalism up to direct attacks on people. Then it kind of was lumped into this set. We interrogated it for features. So each incident was coded for 21 variables, things like a group name or location or tactic or target, and put it into an SPSS data set. I was able to find 27,500 and some odd incidents. So again, 27,000 incidents over about 30, or from 1972 to 2010. And what I did with this data is I did very simple frequency and regression analysis. The idea was that if we could develop an incident-based history, a history of this, or a record of it, we can interrogate analytically, but that is based on actual incidents, either reported by the social movement itself, or or triangulated with police accounts, FBI reports, RCMP reports, British MI5 reports. A lot of the governments are very keen on producing these long, scary reports saying these are all the attacks that we had to deal with in our homeland. So everyone's reporting a lot. The government's reporting a lot. The activists reporting a lot, and no one was really kind of crunching this data. So I did. And again, my intent was I would create a data set that we as a movement asking these tough questions can draw from. And I've used it to provide targeted, data-centric, incident-based answers to people doing work. I think Carol just spoke, I provided her with some. I've provided it to probably 15 people doing different studies. And they say, hey, I'm doing a study about the use of vandalism in Sweden. I say, okay, that's really cool. And I can, generate a transparent data set. That's all incidents of all date ranges in Sweden. Now, one of the things that's interesting and difficult is figuring out kind of the responsibility of holding and using this data. So since it obviously has obvious speculative uses, right, for law enforcement, I have not uploaded the data set or kind of, tried to distribute it in mass, because I think it has, I don't need to save police any time in making their predictions. But again, what I have tried to do is try to integrate it into activist-centric inquiry. And one of the things I'm interested in talking about is other ideas people may have for what we as a social movement can do with data that we as a social movement produced and we as a social movement collected. Kind of how we can use it for our own ends. And the North American Animal Liberation Press Office has used it. So it is, like, in that sense, being used, but I would prefer for it to be used wider. And again, so my attempt is to develop an incident-based history of this movement that's described through actual acts and not through kind of bombastic rhetoric speech. So that's the kind of point, that's the intent. I have about 9 or 10 minutes. So I'm going to read a little bit from kind of the way the chapter phrases itself, and then how the data is used, okay? So this is, so I'll skip the intro, but in the wake of simultaneous attack on the United States by a foreign threat, nations' counterterrorism efforts focused on identifying and dismantling a foreign network of ideological militants with the stated declaration of war. Throughout the period, the U.S. federal government launched a second campaign focused on the elimination of a perceived domestic terrorist threat, the Earth Liberation Front and the Animal Liberation Front. These environmental and animal liberation direct action movements, which have no national history of violence against people, were quickly likened, inflated within the state's rhetoric as domestic terrorists akin to Al-Qaeda or the historically lethal white supremacist, anti-abortion, neo-Nazi movements. This rhetorical effort then developed from hyperbolic discourse into a series of localized police investigations, followed by coordinated, multinational, multi-agency cooperative campaigns involving the combined efforts of all branches of government, executive, legislative, and judiciary. For the executive branches of government, the task has begun to identify and politically frame the threat, to cast it as increasingly threatening while simultaneously manageable, daunting, but able to be defeated. Right, as a side note, this is kind of one of the main things that the field I work in terrorism studies or critical terrorism studies deals with, the idea of the manufacturing of a threat through the label, right? The act of labeling, the act of the kind of fostering a state discourse is what creates this. And one of the reasons this occurs is that, large bureaucracies, and again, I feel like it's moot at this point, but large bureaucracies need to reproduce the conditions of their reproduction, right? As Marx would say. But they need to create a threat in order to kind of exist. And this is very, very, very clear in the use of domestic terrorism legislation. But yeah, I digress. The legislative has been tasked with the establishment of state and federal laws and the legalization of policing processes, even those used by the U.S. military, allowing the government to investigate and prosecute in new ways. For the judiciary, its task has been to be more for the judiciary, its task has been to be more permissive with allowing evidence, even if prejudicial, toward the defendants while using ever more stringent laws as a basis for more severe rulings. In turn, the executive is tasked to pursue individuals via police force, prosecuting those arrested through laws enacted by the legislature. In total, domestic policing, portrayed as counterterrorism, portrayed as a counterterrorism strategy by the state, is based on a shared responsibility held by the government as a whole. This is a case study to identify and deconstruct this counterterrorism strategy that is targeting the networks associated with the ALF and the ELF, which traces the state's perceived threat identification, and later examining the methods used to disrupt and capture. One of the things I think is important that for us to do when we have these kind of nuanced explanations is to separate out tactics and strategies, right? And most often as we're talking about the tactics, right? We're talking about the federal grand juries, talking about electronic eavesdropping, we're talking about the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act, talking about ag laws. But really what I'm attempting to do is to talk about the strategy, right? The state has a strategy. I think sometimes we see state actions, especially really repressive ones, as them kind of flashing out in the dark and being really reactionary. And while that's true, and it was certainly true in our response kind of globally, into 9/11, but certainly it's been a number of years, right? It's been 14 years. The government's kind of gotten its footing. They're not off filter anymore. They're on message. They know what they're doing, and they're engaging in this very strategically, right? This is a strategic endeavor. So the counterterrorism strategy employed by the government has been dubbed the Green Scare by activists. I'm sure it's not a new term to you guys, so I'll skip some of that. The reactionary development of the Green Scare label coincided with the state's own invented language, in an attempt to quantify and label their enemies under one banner, namely eco-terrorism. A term largely said to be coined by the government around 2002. Prior to that time, such networks were discussed under such labels such as, quote, special interest extremists. That was a term the FBI used in 2001. And then later in a speech by the same man in 2001, he started using the eco-terrorist label for the first time in earnest. And a lot of people kind of know the rhetoric parts of it, but Louis Freeh, who at the time was the director of the FBI, called the ALF one of the most active extremist elements in the U.S. And again, this has been 3 years after 9/11. And there's even more idiotic statements from Rick Santorum and some other folks in the Senate if you want to really look at extreme comparisons that have no basis in reality. So the kind of first, in a sense, methodological / tactical point I was trying to make, I have in the book, which says, a peer-reviewed quantitative study reveals that the ALF and the ELF incidents during a 2001-2002 period, this is the period we're talking about when action was supposed to have necessitated the Unknown Enterprise Terrorism Act, that during this period we can show quantitatively that actions decreased almost by 50%, right? So if this law is a response, it's the wrong response at the wrong time, right? And again, I'm arguing that it's a strategy. It's not just them swinging back at us. It's not a response to anything. It's part of a strategy to criminalize dissent. But during this time period, again, this time period being the time period when they're using, the state is saying, what harsh law. During this time, the quote, violent extremists did not aim for a single person. We have about 100, again, according to my research, we have 160 incidents which are occurring in the US between 2001 and 2002, specifically during this period. Of these 160 incidents, 69% constitute petty vandalism. Again, I don't mean petty in a not important way, I mean petty in a legal way. So we're talking about the gluing of locks, graffiti, breaking windows, slashing the tires. Right? This is not a major felonious behavior. 17.5%, so 6% arson, attempted arson, which again I know people have issue with. Some people have issue with. But I think if we want to talk about the law, we have to talk about dispassion, right? And to me, arson is just a more financially effective way of breaking more windows and slashing more tires. There's a really great quote that's often thrown around in terrorism studies. The specific, I'll butcher, which I guess is the specious term. But anyway, but you know, what it says is that those who call themselves terrorists are just people who are more sure in the utility aspect of violence, right? They'll understand like, what violence does, and what we have here is people who are engaging in, quote, eco-terrorism are some of these people who believe in the tactical or strategic utility more of violence than anyone else. And I think if we're going to think about who considers violence to be most effective, the obvious answer to that would be the U.S. and other governments who are very keen on using violence for all sorts of objectives. Okay, so again, we have 160 incidents during this time. 69% are vandalism, 17.5% are arson, 13% are the theft or release of captive animals, what is often termed animal release or animal liberation. And again, even if you take arson out of the equation, which I would argue there's no need to, but even if you were, I find it really difficult to understand that most people, again, your average, Joe on the street, would have such a severe problem with petty vandalism and the theft and release of animals, right? One of the reasons, again, I did this study is that when you read the government studies, they often describe this as a bunch of bomb throwing, bomb setting anarchists. And yes, bombings occur, but they occur in such an extreme minority that actually, in most of these formulations, whether it's just a US data set or just a multi-year data set, are less than 1%. You're looking at like 0.02%, 0.01%. If you look in the globe over the 30-year period, the numbers are minuscule. And one of the things I show, and again, I now realize all of a sudden I'm on video, so I can actually show this. But what was I? But so there's a chart, right? I know it's not. I don't actually expect you to be able to read the chart from here, but what I use is, again, I use incidents. And again, this seems simple, but one of the reasons it's dumbfounding is it didn't exist. So I use actual incidents. An incident, it has to be tracked and proven or triangulated, and then you plot it on a chart. It really is not very difficult. And so you can see the kind of ebb and flow of these. And again, it seems to have its own ebb and flow, totally regardless of the legislation. None of it appears to be reactionary. But again, there really is no way to know this besides interviewing respondents and asking them. So that's the kind of last, I'll wrap it up here. One of the things that this part of research, they interviewed clandestine activists, former clandestine activists, people who I would imagine were at the time parent clandestine activists in the UK. And one of the most interesting things I found is that these activists, and again, you can argue about generalizability, representative samples all day, but at least the people who I gathered through a snowball sample, they were very aware of this kind of discursive connection, right? They understood the movement's history. They knew when the activists were very, very cognizant of the law and very cognizant of the disconnect between the law as a reaction. So no one was kind of fooled by this, right? Maybe the FBI was fooling its people, or maybe the American public was fooled via the FBI. None of the people kind of by this, activists, seem to be on all. And people who I spoke to were very, very aware of the intentionality of the process of printing. And I kind of leave it there, and I hope we can get into some words that you towards the end. So thank you, guys.
Our next speaker will be Anthony Nochella. He's the Executive Director of Access and he's the editor of the book Terrorization of Dissent, that has been mentioned before by Karen. He will talk about a green criminology perspective on eco-terrorism.
Thank you.
He'll be back with us. So yeah, I just wanted to kind of go through the table of contents and then talk to you a little bit about my chapter and some of the work that I've done around this and why I think it's important. Terrorization is a new term, and I think in the 50s and the 60s, people spoke a great deal during the Red Scare about the criminalization of activists, and I think now post 2001, we're really speaking about dissent from a terrorization, right? And I think we all kind of agree on that. So, the book Terrorists for Freedom Fighters, was kind of influenced by our wonderful Ronald Reagan. And he said one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. And he was speaking about the Contra and the war in Central America. So here's four individuals thinking about terrorism and activism and social change from a different perspective, right? So you have Martin Luther King. If a man hasn't, we'll take the context of, that he's speaking about all people. If a man hasn't discovered something that he will die for, he isn't fit to live. So we have somebody that's extreme and saying that, try to find something. And then we have the Earth Liberation Front, 1997, part of a communique who says, we have to show the enemy that we are serious about defending what is scared. So, sacred. And then we have John Lewis, who's former, he's not very active anymore, but he really started the whole movement towards, stigmatizing and terrorizing the ELF and ALF and the animal rights and the Earth Liberation movements. So he said investigating and preventing animal rights extremism and eco-terrorism is one of the FBI's highest domestic terrorism priorities. While at that same time period, we know there's an extreme amount of right-wing violence, developing, as well as, militias that are local, right? And then we have the last quote, one man willing to throw his life away is enough to terrorize thousands. And if we know anything about the history of terrorism, it was actually a good term used for the military during the reign of terror, that an individual would run in the field and say, identify himself as a terrorist to fight for his military, right? And then the other ones on the other side would say, oh my gosh, it's a terrorist, willing to do anything to protect his or her or their, side, right? So we have to understand the American values. And if we understand the American values, we can create massive social change. And so I think the Earth Liberation Front, the Animal Liberation Front really understand through images, through rhetoric, through communiques, as well as supporters have kind of identified these issues. And so it's not that young 17-year-olds are breaking property, right, for the hell of it, and breaking stuff is fun. And I think we need to get out of that. They understand that breaking things, if you look from an anarchist perspective, property is the foundation of capitalism, and that everything in this world, air, water, people, all have a value. And if you kind of went to Kim's presentation, she was breaking down from an atheist perspective on the value from God to minerals, right? So we have to look at these things. Social direction, technology. We want to manage the WTO. We want to manage the World Bank. We want to manage the United Nations. So we want to say at one step, we are ending, hunger and starvation and ending war, as well as, and one might say in slang, the salvation perspective, right? Targets are changing. The 1960s and 1970s, the Black Liberation Army, the Black Panther Party, the Weather Underground, the Sudanese Liberation Army, really targeted the government individuals and agencies and kidnapping them and bombing and protesting them. But today we understand that capitalism really rules the world as well as the U.S. government. So the activists are shifting our targets when we protest as well as resist and things of that sort. So what are these typical forms of repression that we understand? Home raids, grand juries, legal battles, which Carol and Kim and a few others are dealing with right now, and a million other people are dealing with that. Black Lives Matter is dealing with that. So many movements are dealing with legal battles. It's to get you busy doing one thing while not able to organize the street to be effective, right? Surveillance makes people really paranoid, creates, if you have a disability, if you don't have a disability, it creates this paranoia, not being able to move, which, Tyler was kind of noted, saying, you can put as much surveillance as possible, phones are everywhere, the computer's on, we're not going to stop, right? Labeling people, which should be like stigmatizing them, right? We kind of noted that. Some of the laws, as Carol and Mike kind of noted. Here's some of the predicaments, right? We as a conflict resolution person or conflict studies person, they always focus on interest versus position. If you base yourself in a position, you can't move, right? And so you should look at the interest of what your goal is. And the U.S. government has located themselves in a position rather than an interest. And so they get to define who's a terrorist, and then once they define who's a terrorist, then they have a law that says, I can't talk to you anymore, I'm sorry, while they educate many of these individuals. So this is the law for the U.S. Department of State talking about that they can't speak about or speak with or communicate or engage with individuals. 1 minute in the 1980s, they're educating them in the United States, and then 90s or 2000s, they are noting that they're terrorists and they can't communicate with them. So this is kind of, noting some of the other elements, like first, to not work with anyone that has an anti-capitalist initiative. Second, to imprison all threats of anti-capitalism. And this is kind of risen out of the battle in Seattle. If anybody knows that, there was a lot of the annual reports from the FBI that was noting specifically we need to critique, we need to keep surveillance and repress anybody that has a strong anti-capitalist agenda. And of course, they don't want to write a 1,000-page report. It's typically around 80 pages. And so they just noted animal rights, environmentalists, and anarchists. And they would repeat that, for many years to come. And so we need to understand when we talk to each other, there's no such thing as a terrorist. They don't go walking around and bombing things 24/7. Terrorism is a tactic, right? And the tactic, as we can see, while revolution is a larger system of strategies that are connected, and terrorism might be one of those, right? And if you use that rhetoric or not, right? While the right wing, as well as corporate America, as well as the U.S. government and many governments use the term terrorism. So looking through that, lens, we have to see terrorism, and we have to critique those, as kind of Michael notes, in the field of critical terrorism studies. We need to articulate that terrorism is not, a full-blown revolution, right? Some people are flying 1 minute and they're bombing a building another minute, right? So you can't call all of that stuff. So here's the FBI annual report in 2000-2001. There's no single universal definition of terrorism. And I'm going to go through some really quick definitions to really articulate that nobody, no government, no agency has said this is the definition. Some people say that only coercion to an individual physically is terrorism. Then there's individuals that say, as you can see, the unlawful use of force, violence against persons or property to intimidate or coerce a government, right? And furtherance of political or social change. And that could be used, and we can see this through the Patriot Act verbally. So if you shout too loud or protest too loud, or, that could look, or be defined as terrorism. Right? So here's some other definitions. The FBI definition: unlawful use of force and violence through persons or property. Walter, the chair of the International Research Council, focusing on terrorism and guerrilla. He says terrorism constitutes the illegitimate use of force. So we're looking at this force, right? And what does force mean? And it's very vague, very general. Mark Soma, if anybody knows him, he is a radical environmental professor doing great work, and he was the co-chair of the Environmental Revolution Conference in 2002, which had a lot of wonderful people at. And one of the things that many people don't know is the conference went off with a bang. I think Leslie was there, Craig Rosenblatt was there, a variety of other individuals were there, Coronado, Steve Best, Kim, I forget her last name, so from Earth First. So a lot of wonderful people were there. And in the parking lot was a far right-wing gentleman with a shotgun and a rifle. And he was arrested prior to the conference going off. And he was targeting possibly the conference goers. These are things that we have to understand, that just because you think law enforcement's coming after you, we also had an individual with a rifle at a conference. So that doesn't, I don't want to scare you all, and there's nobody in parking lots today, but why are they focusing so much on us while there's some people that could be in a parking lot? So other kind of definitions that are kind of noted, I'll kind of go through that really quick. Social movement actors, positions. John Burdick, he's a social movement theorist. He says, do not discuss terrorism whatsoever. So Anthony, stop talking. Because the more you do, the more you feed into this fear and rhetoric and analysis. Where Churchill says, use the state definition against them and say that the government is the true terrorist, right? Chomsky says, use the state definition to point out how the acts that they're doing around the world are, and he looks from a more international and global perspective, are terrorism, right? So, and then rap and feminist and queer people say, just reclaim it, right? And if you've seen Will Potter's site, he's like, all my best friends are terrorists and things of that sort. So it is going on. And the Earth Liberation spokesperson points out the state definition, how it includes political activists. So as we are doing now, right? So we need to understand these people are political prisoners and political prisoners of war, not terrorists, right? So building a coalition, we need to, and I'll note that, and I think everybody understands and the history of the Animal Liberation Front and the Earth Liberation Front, so I'll kind of move through that really quick. But build genuine relationships, right? Not tokenizing somebody up here to speak about, like the BLA or the Black Panther Party or Black Lives Matter movement or the Ferguson movement, and then just hey, thanks so much for coming. So build relationships. Be at these rallies with no agenda. Don't have your why vegan pamphlets out. Just generally be there, and then you'll build relationships because they'll understand that you have a commitment, right? So build a global community of resistance and understand that you won't all agree on everything, but that you truly want to have a global revolution with similar tactics. And that's kind of when I was building relationships, I could see that I could talk about tactics and strategies a lot more than I could talk about politics. And then once we get away from tactics and strategies, then we can talk about politics, right? So actions, the decentralized movement, which we know is the Earth and Animal Liberation movement. And it's very hard to kind of note, right? I'm going to go through the ELF stuff and the ALF stuff and then kind of focus on the communication structure is really simple, right? Start with guidelines, can't be changed, started in 1976 by Ronnie Lee and then a snitch. And then the members you have that you don't know, anybody can be it, doctor, lawyer, person with disabilities, queer person, professor, whatever. and then spokespeople. Some people have debates on if they agree with spokespeople or not. They say the communicate speaks for themselves, just post it, or we'll post it. Or they also say we shouldn't have communicates, we should just do actions. Communicates are getting really a liability, and a number of people have been investigated, or their homes have been raided because the sending out of the communique, because there's always a little fingerprint on the internet. So it's becoming harder and harder, right? And then the public support, like us here, and we're, we don't know who's underground, but we can give support through financial means, or through sending books, or sending letters, or just having a shirt that says, I support the ALF, right? So we have the Achilles heel. So what makes the ALF weak if they're decentralized? Well, people involved in the organization often do understand the serious threats. They don't understand the consequences. So understand, putting up a sticker that says eating meat under a stop sign that's red that you got, understand that that might be a misdemeanor. That's vandalism. So are you willing to do vandalism if you have 2 children and a full-time job and you're going to grad school? If not, then most likely you don't understand these risks, right? People do, get targeted. People involved often compromise or discredit the ALF or inform, others of the snitching. So are you understanding the people around you and you trust these people? Find out where they grew up. Find out, I want to meet your parents. I want to know who you are. Just because somebody posted ALF on their Facebook or MySpace or whatever else, Twitter, doesn't mean that they're legitimate. So we have to really understand who they are and become friends, right? Members conduct actions with people they are romantically, engaged with, and that there's a history of that. You should probably not do that. There's already enough stress and intentions going on that having other relationships that are subversive and other people in the cells in the collective, you don't want to add that into it. Despite the fact that the organization is decentralized, people both within and out, ownership of the ALF is often claimed and attributed to particular clique or hierarchical individuals, saying like, oh, we're ALF, and you're not, and all these things. Or it's machismo and masculine and white able-bodied men, right? So we have to understand that the ALF could be anybody, right? But it has, a very specific identity sometimes, right? So I'm going to look at the Green Anarchist. I have a few, extra slides. You got 2 minutes? Cool. Okay. So from a Green Anarchist perspective, and Green Anarchism is new in the last 10, 15 years, and it's one of the fields, a subfield of critical criminology or radical criminology, which comes from a Marxist perspective, saying that punitive justice prisons are bad, right? So in criminology, people say, oh my God, criminology is horrible people. But there's people that are doing transformative justice and restorative justice and things of that sort. So I defined in my chapter eco-deviance, basically similar to the classic criminal deviance, if you ever taught the deviant behavior class. Corporations reckless destroying everything in pursuit of selfish interest to exploit the environment and animals is eco-deviance. So we have to kind of begin to articulate just like the other side is. So eco-control, like social control, again, another term in sociology or criminology. As corporations become global, they seek to dominate the earth, water, everything, and we can see that. So eco-terrorism, while officials argue that who destroys McDonald's or frees not human animals are individuals that are terrorists, we need to say that those that are clear-cutting the redwoods or destroying whales for oil, or putting animals in zoos and circuses, those are the real terrorists, and we need to articulate why this is. So we need to reclaim the rhetoric, and that's what green criminologists kind of know. As a critical race theorist, I noted this in a chapter of Circle of Compassion by Will Tuttle, and I had a chapter in there, and I just wanted to note, and we kind of talked about that, after the conference. I just wanted to read this, and I think we need to articulate this in the era of the Black Lives Matter movement and the Ferguson movement. Is while activists have certainly been repressed, no doubt, right, and horribly. I don't want to develop those stories. I think we all know those. Most of the animals and eco-terrorists who have been arrested are privileged white able-bodied men, not all, but who have paid lawyers, college degrees, socioeconomic dispensations. I suspect that if a group of black youth destroyed a McDonald's by bombing it for political reasons, like Move in the 1990s, but they never bombed anything, right? They just had a home and protested the zoo every so often. In the name of the ALF, they would be likely receiving life sentences and carrying them out. And to this day, we can see this political prisoner writing that these individuals from 40 years ago are still incarcerated, right? And they're still going after Assad Shakur and trying to bring her back into this country. So this is the last slide, or the second to last slide. Security culture, really simple. Communication with others, know it, don't talk over the phone, be aware of it. Drugs in the movement, try to be as much as sober when you're doing action and activism. And I think that's really important. You want to be in your complete right state of mind. Know your limits. It's okay to say, only thing I can do is 3 hours a year. And that's cool. Don't promise anything to other people. Don't feel like you're letting anybody down. Do what you think you can do. And nobody should shame anybody for not doing as much as another person. And I'm at fault for doing it too. I'm like, oh, why isn't everybody doing as much as I? And I have to really say, that's what that person can do. And we have to kind of challenge ourselves. Know about snitches, and know the risk of that, and then to know a snitch is somebody that grows from our movement, an infiltrator is somebody that grows out of our movement that's paid, like a provocateur, an agent, or an infiltrator. And then this is one movement, or a weekend of action that we did. It was the National Week of Action, and hopefully we'll do more of these National Weeks of Action. We did one recently, it was a week of action for Kevin and Tyler that were going up to the court date in Chicago. So that's a little bit about it. And I just want to say that I'll go through this really amazing list of table of contents. We'll keep it up here as we talk and things, but as Dylan and Brad and Carol are doing interviews of current or former political prisoners, as you can see, like in part 4, there's people that are theorizing, that are lawyers, that are rhetoric, that are communications professors, of philosophy, sociology professors, talking about corporate repression. There's the legal individuals. So we have a variety of other individuals. And then Pierce Burns, one of the co-founders of Green Criminology, wrote the forward. So again, thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you. I just can't stop thinking about the Red Scare propaganda that was made during the U.S. interventions in Latin America. And there is a very symbolic, data, which was 9/11 of 1973. And there was a guy called Salvador Allende from Chile, and he was elected by the people. For the first time, there were elections in this country. The problem was this guy was a problem for the U.S. Economic interests. Why? Because there was a big corporation called United Fruit Company, and the problem was that this guy started to give land to the people. He started to give education freely for the people, and this was a big problem. So this guy was connotated with terrorists, with the Russian threat. And I'm thinking about two things. One of them is propaganda, which presupposes the demonization of its politics, and also the concerning of corporation goals. We are talking about, in this case, of United Fruit Company. So there was a coup d'etat, we say like this, right? Yeah. Supported by CIA, by Richard Nixon, and of course by the name of the guy. There was another guy. But the thing here is that I can find many resemblances between propaganda, law that serves corporations and big companies that are determined as individuals, which is mind-boggling how is it possible that a corporation is viewed as an individual? I think it's mind-boggling. And I think we can find many similarities between both of propaganda and also the defending of corporation interests, controlling of a country for economic goals, and the controlling of the public's mind when you talk about, for example, the livestock industry. And I think that's a problem because you face here particularly. I think in Europe the system is a little bit different. Of course, there are many types of lobbies, but it's about lobbies. Also, it's about lobbies, but in here I think it's different. For example, let's have the case of Iraq invasion. You have a guy called Dick Cheney, and he was a director of this very big armed facility, and this guy was on the government. So I don't think, for sure he was one of the responsibles for the Iraq invasion. And once again, we're talking about demonization of people, in this case of Iraqis. We're talking about crime wars and also terrorism. And we are seeing a switch of roles, because what happened in Iraq was a mass murdering. We're talking about 1 million of civilians who were killed. We're talking about the invasion of a country without the United Nations permission to do this. Okay? And we also talk about propaganda, lots of propaganda. There was a illegitimate invasion. There was, in fact, terrorism, because we're talking about killings of civilians. And we're talking about the profiteering of corporations in Iraq. And I think for us it can be useful, because I think the way of functioning in terms of propaganda plus the defending of corporation interests, it has many similarities. And of course the demonization of the ones who want to set free rights, human rights, non-human rights, non-animal rights, etc. So thank you for your information.
Those are all good observations. I'm looking, so just raise your hand and make me list.
Thank you. Thanks for your talk. In fact, I have questions for Anthony. Mainly things that I want to know. First, I didn't see your book. This book on the table to buy in here? Okay. So, we're good. I would like to know tips on how to communicate with others. You just said it very quickly. I would love to have more information on that. Also, what are the most effective form of activism in your mind? Which suggestion would you have? And also suggestion to build solidarities with non-median communities and activists.
First, if you want to know like what's the most effective activism, you have to ask Mike and Carol.
Okay, yeah, the questions are for everyone.
They would like statistically analyze like what's effective, when, how, where.
Well, I think Michael talked about it.
Yeah.
And he said, we're talking about tactics, we need to be talking about strategy. And that was the point of his talk, right? So we need to stop thinking about what's the most effective tactic. Tactics are tools, be open-minded, all the tools are in the toolbox, know which tools you're willing to use and not to use, and then start thinking strategically about, maybe you really like outreach, so go do vegan outreach, but outreach probably isn't gonna stop, it's probably not going to stop mass production of big ag. It's probably not the outreach is probably not gonna be the weakest link in stopping, for higher animal testing facilities, right? So all tactics are important, all tactics are valid, all tactics are viable, but as Michael said, we need to start thinking about strategy. So figure out where someone said to me yesterday, figure out where power is. Where's power? Where's the weakest link? How do you go at that target? And what is an effective tactic or body of tactics to go at that target? And so I think you just have to be strategic. If you're doing above ground activism, be collaborative, talk about it, workshop it, figure it out, and figure out what you're doing before you start doing it, and come with some special, I teach program planning, so I teach people how to have human service programs in human service agencies, and make them put evaluation measures in. So pick a point in time when you stop and see if it was successful and reevaluate. So that's what I would say about that. I don't know if Michael would add, and then I don't want to derail you from all the questions.
You want to go?
Yeah, I think a lot of what Carol said, I agree with. All of the different tactics that we, and I'm saying like we standing in front of you today, like we talk about amongst ourselves, are tactics within a similar strategy, right? The strategy being economic sabotage, providing economic disincentive. We engage in other things, certainly, but all of these things are just that one strategy. So yes, that works. It's extremely effective. It's been extremely effective throughout history, from the slave revolts in the ancient times up to the Boston Tea Party, up to today. And certainly, destroying people's things, make them listen to you, to make it very simple. So I think that we can talk about strategy, but I think that one of the things we can do as far as like bridging what is effective and what is support is we have to make sure that some of these discussions go on in venue appropriate places. So for example, the last thing I want to see is when I feel like I'll step back for a second. I feel like we've gotten to a bit of a point that when there are arrests in animal liberationist or liberationist communities, that when mainstream media is looking for who to comment on that, some of the first people they turn to are the Sierra Club and Greenpeace, or people who may not share tactical affiliation. So tactical affinity is fine, but I feel like there's a bit of I can't show this quantitatively, but I feel like there's a bit of an increase of more mainstream groups growing, more marginalized groups under the bus, in this condemnation. And you can look at really famous cases, whereas, after the famed ELF fire in Vail, Colorado, that destroyed a ski resort, the first people to condemn that were environmental organizations who said, well, we've been protesting this for years. And, the rhetorical talkback is, well, yeah, but we burned it down because your campaign didn't succeed. That's precisely why. So again, I think that one of the ways, as a strategy for support, but also as a strategy, is discussions where you kind of take the tactic out of it. And yeah, we can discuss the strategy, but a public debate about what's more tactically, in this detached kind of contextless nature of like what's more effective, a rock, a bomb, or a match is really almost impossible to determine. But I think those debates are often had and are wholly unproductive.
The question of what activism is most effective is also which type of activism, whatever, is also something that people think about a lot, or also ask me, or we have a lot of discussions about that. And what I think is also very important to note is that society is not like a jukebox that you can put this comment and then this solution will come out, or then we have this reaction, you can plan everything. Sometimes if you cannot plan things, or you would not hope that this or that action might generate this public response. I mean, we had a talk yesterday about the Royal Institute in Sao Paulo, and nobody would have thought that this would happen, and then the Royal Institute has to close down, etc. So things that can happen that you cannot foresee. And I think what is also very important that we have a solidarity within the movement for a diversity of tactics. This is about something that could have been criticized for the panel yesterday that we had about praxis, kind of a combination of animal liberation from and economic sabotage, actions that are, I would say, very powerful and effective and are as an inspiration for a lot of activists or people who are not activists yet, but then they see how powerful this can be and beautiful. So I think it's very important that we are like tolerant within the movement, and that we see like, okay, I want to do leverage, I want to do other stuff, and we still respect and support each other. Because at the state, this is exactly what they want to do. I don't know how you say it in English, the Latin is divide et impera, so divide
social movement throughout time is controlled by governments, that there's cycles of protest, and at the height of the cycle of protest, you're working across movements, as Anthony's saying we should do, and organizations within a movement across the diversity of strategy and tactic and ideology are working together, and that's where movements grow. And then through selective facilitation and repression, you bifurcate a movement, and so the moderates in the middle have to choose sides, and so they have to pick. No longer are they the bridge builders between the radicals and the conservatives. They now have to, not many people have done work on this, but I hate saying I just wrote a paper, but I did just write a paper. I worked with scholars, no one's talking about this part of it, and I worked with scholars studying AIDS ACT UP movement, which is great radical movement, civil rights movement, and we looked at our moderates, and we found that moderate organizations consistently just have to make a choice when selective facilitation or repression happens, because as Michael was saying, groups, the most conservative groups immediately distance themselves from the radicals, and you lose solidarity across movements in a social movement sector and across organizations in one social movement. And so these moderates get put in a very difficult position, and then they usually become more, their facilitation is happening. It's always going to be easier to hand out a vegan outreach pamphlet. I'm not saying you should do it. That's always going to be easier than going and standing outside of someone's house and protesting, or engaging in any sort of antisocial activism gets labeled as radical, whether it's illegal or legal, right? And so that's always going to be more challenging. So if you don't have a body of people willing to do that, then you're going to have a bifurcated movement, and so governments facilitate those who are the weakest link in terms of revolution, but who might have popular appeal. So it looks like, the Humane Society is going to get, they're going to get to talk in front of Senate about animal issues, while the people who are engaging in illegal actions who are identified with the ALF are going to be labeled as terrorists. And what do you think the groups are in the middle are going to do? They're not going to be, they're going to take the easier route, because they need to stay functional and viable. And as a movement, we're not coming together. We're getting to this point. Repression always means facilitation is happening. And as Michael was saying, what happens then is our movement turns on each other, and we had the Humane Society offered reward money for radical activists.
Yeah, can I say something actually? I saw a really, I think sometimes people think that this is maybe a dated debate, but I saw something really disturbing. A few days ago, so I teach at Georgetown, and we did this in Washington, D.C., and we did this, Georgetown community did this environmental film festival, and the apex of this environmental film festival was the first, I think, U.S. screening, or the first East Coast screening of Wrenched. If anyone has heard of or not heard of, it wrenched like a wrench, like a monkey wrench. And it's a biographical account of Edward Abbey, who wrote The Monkey Wrench Gang, who's the he's a radical environmentalist, or an amazing anarchist thinker, and he's the inspiration, behind 30 years of radical environmental activism. Specifically, the sort of thing that kind of came out of Earth First. Well, the movie's great, and Abbey's great. They really do a good job talking about anarchism and its connections to ecology. But about 50 or 60% of the way through the movie, it takes a really vile turn, without most people even noticing it. And it starts showing these examples of ELF. And really quickly, this group is like, well, like, we're cool with like acetylene torches knocking down Nevada desert in the 70s. These people who are like setting fire to like luxury homes, like, that's way different. And they really clearly, but kind of insidiously, like, separate out good protester, bad protester. But again, it's not Greenpeace and the ELF, or HSUS and the ALF. It's 1970s radical environmentalism, because it was necessary then. And 2000s, almost the exact same tactics. But again, making a kind of discursive shift that kind of, now that we're in an era of terrorism, and then now we're kind of in this like post-guerrilla time, that all of those things that we're phrasing in the past are now illegitimate, or when articulated by the president. And the first comment that was made at this film, so it's like a typical college thing where they show a film in a room like you guys are in right now, and then when they're finished, it's a panel of experts. And the first person said was, I really agree with the way that movie, reading my politics into it. It was a very present. So again, that's just one example. And I was very excited to see this like nuanced discussion of ecological anarchism and Edward Abbey and direct action. And it really just, it just threw these people under the bus. And I don't know any other term for it, but it just really sold them out way before even you had a chance to have them sold out in media or government accounts.
Gandhi had like 4 steps to creating social change. Like one, they first ignore you, then they stigmatize you, and then they repress you, and then they accept you, right? So we have to understand these steps and how these steps are building, because if you are being labeled and you're being laughed at from your friends, your family, whatever, get ready for some like repression from them or outside individuals as well. That means possibly being investigated by your dean or your chair, or not getting as many jobs, you know, or not getting a job. And you know, when one of us gets a job or gets a PhD like Jenny or Mike, that is a win for us. You know, Mike and Jenny did not, and Carol and like others in this room did not compromise on their politics when it came to their dissertation. And you know, we have to, even if it's lonely, if it's scary, and you don't think that you're going to get a job out of it. That's not why we do what we do. We do what we do because it's the right thing to do. And at the end of the day, we can sleep, or maybe not. But you know, but I can guarantee you, we found each other, and like scream as loud as you possibly can what your heart believes in, and other people, if they believe in that same thing, will find you. And I think that's why we're here today, because we feel lonely. Because we're going to go off to like Reno, or we're going to go off to Minneapolis, or we're going to go off to Mankato, and we're going to feel alone. But then those moments, like we're going to find each other, and we're like, damn, I might not agree with everything, but like at least like we have each other. And I think that's so important to not just say you are this organization, I'm PETA and you're HSUS, we're coming together for this conference. No, we're friends, and we have to build friendships. We have to care about each other. So when we're depressed, we're sad, we're hurting, we lost our friend, like, note that. That's important. That's the stuff that's going to like, keep us going like for 30 years down the road. And that's, what kept me going for like the last 20 years, right? So I think that needs to be like noted if you're talking about like solidarity. And so don't look at the Black Matters movement as like this organization of the other, but build friendships. And then like prove yourself to them, do work your ass off as much as you possibly can. And then, they'll ask one day, hey, do you want to go out to eat? And you're like, yeah, cool. And then they ask, why are you eating that? And then you just kind of introduce it. And I think that's how you build any friendship, right? Like, you don't just kind of throw somebody all your politics right off the bat and expect like a relationship. Maybe on OkCupid, but I mean, like, that's not us, right? And so like, I would say, those things. And then also, if we really want to get, you want to do some more reading, Gene Sharp. He used to be noted in the like No Compromise and a lot of other things. He had like 160 different strategies. I just did a book called Educating for Action, which is really practical strategies. On the Earth First Manual, you can get it on PDF. You can get that down. And then, as Mike kind of noted, economic sabotage. Economic sabotage is kind of an umbrella tactic of many tactics. Boycotting is economic sabotage. Blockading a building for the purpose of losing business for that day is economic sabotage. Economic sabotage is not just property destruction. So we need to understand, like, one minute you're protesting for economic sabotage, and another moment you're doing it for educational awareness. So, like, you have to understand that these tactics can be moved into different umbrellas, all depending your purpose. And then kind of what I think kind of Carol was kind of noting, and then I'll stop, is that if we're going to create change, or you're going to pick a tactic, I don't think, and then again, I don't agree with that. No one votes. So I'm just like, hey, everybody vote. I think like all tactics are good. I think that So I'm biased in that perspective, and I'll own it because of my politics. But I also agree that pick a tactic you feel comfortable with, and nobody should shame anybody. But you should push yourself a little in an uncomfortable way in trying new tactics, right? With your abilities that will allow you. But don't put other people in a shaming perspective in this movement. We do it all the time. ALF is the baddest group in town. No, they're not, right? Like, there's a lot of people that are doing amazing work that are not having mass lung breaking shit. And I think that we need to get out of the shaming of like what tactic you're doing. It might not be the tactic you're doing, and we have books and articles and journals to critique those tactics. It doesn't mean we have to like destroy like certain organizations. Critique the tactic, not the individual or the organization. If you have a legitimate critique, you don't need to bring up people like when you're doing this, which we do via Facebook. And Facebook has done a lot of mobilization, but it's destroyed like each other as well.
Can I just ask just a follow-up question really quickly about this? Because actually I'm preparing a talk for feminists and green and ecologists, and actually I do critique tactics a lot because I critique precisely racist tactic, sexist tactic, ableist tactic within the animal movement in order to show or to try to show them that we are trying to be conscious of this because we are really labeled, at least in Montreal, as a racist and sexist movement. So I am actually doing this. I'm criticizing a lot of the tactics in our movement.
Which is
Do you think
good.
I should do
To
that?
focus on the tactic. These people, this is what they're doing day in and day out. That's how they got their jobs. Or Mike's about to, he's got a lot of jobs.
I wanted to briefly comment on what you said about us having jobs before we move on, because I think that Anthony pointed out that most of us are academics and that it is lonely and there is repression. I got told to my face at a job, the animal thing is why we're not hiring you. Everything's great with the animal thing. But I do want us to remember the amount of privilege that we have to even be in this position. So Michael talked about his amazing data set. And just to clarify, Great Minds Think Alike, we were doing similar work at the same time. So I handed out a handout, Michael, so I didn't want them to think that that was your stuff because you might not like how I represented it. But I did just a U.S. data set that was smaller than Michael's data set. And I used it to critique intra-movement debates about the role of radicalism. And I took activist debates and I empirically tested them, and it's out there somewhere in a book and no one's reading it. And Michael's doing all this great work and no one's reading it. So what we do need to remember, and there's so many people in this room doing such important work it's like you had such a great critique of like just sort of like consumer driven movements and lifestyle movements and what that means. And we're all doing great work, but we need to remember our privilege means that it's our job to be the carrier of that work into activist communities, because we are sometimes being discounted, but we are extremely, extremely privileged. So it's up to us to take up the canon of being great in our disciplines, but studying things that matter for social justice and finding ways to bridge the gulf between, I call it the ivory trap, like the ivory trap and the rest of the world. It is our job to open those gates, and not to open those gates to let people in, but to carry it out, and to carry it out in meaningful ways that are accessible, that aren't entrapped in all of the ableism, sexism, and racism of the academy, and the language of the academy that's so challenging. So it's our job with our privilege, no matter how lonely we feel, to remember we're privileged and to be translators and change makers.
Yeah. One of the things that I sort of take from each of the talks that the three of you sort of given and sort of continuing on is one of the things that I think about, especially when Anthony's talking about sort of like meeting people in other movements, is the like way in which, especially being young academics, we sort of end up in these like nomadic sort of existences where sort of like you move from city to city, sort of school to school, and then you like hop around jobs and like, yes, that does come with an immense amount of privilege. And so this idea of like security culture becomes very difficult when you sort of like move town constantly, and so like you're in a master's program for 2 years and then you're probably gonna go somewhere else. The developing of those relationships gets very difficult, and so I really wanted to say I appreciate that reminder that it's in some ways still our responsibility, and that it is about this sort of coalition building between across movements, and that you know, I was stuck in like rural Illinois for a while, and like rural Missouri for a while, and then like the deep south of Louisiana, and so like that sort of like movement sort of like really makes you're like difficult and sort of like feels like siloed. It feels so isolating in these kinds of ways, and so I appreciate these kinds of conferences for those kinds of conversations, but as well as that like kind of reminder that like it's still possible in all of those locations, and that we are all sort of doing this work. And so Michael, I just want to say like I really appreciate that like offer to share the data, but like the simultaneous like concern with not just like 4channing it or whatever into the universe. And so I mean, that's not as much a question, but just sort of a comment. But if any of you wanted to talk about sort of like that sort of nomadic isolation sense in any other kind of way, that would be fun too.
And here would be great to tell, like, the family had to be split up, right?
Yeah, so I live, my family's split between Cincinnati, Ohio, and Washington, D.C., about 500 miles apart. And that's, you know, because of it. And again, like, I mean, what Carol said, I take a lot of heart to. And you know, so it is a bit of a double-edged sword is not the right word, but I'm on a couple hours of sleep. I don't know if I said that before. But anyway, it's the problem, because, you know, what is the venue and what is the proper way to kind of critique and complain about this? You know, because there is an intrinsic amount of privilege complaining about adjunct work. But yeah, so you know, I was unable to find sustained work in Cincinnati, so I went back to DC where I have a good network here. But there's a couple points. Yeah, so I teach 5 courses this semester, and then I'll return to Cincinnati in a couple of weeks and probably go to teach nothing. So I'll go from teaching 5 courses and running 2 fellowships and working nights at a bar to like doing almost nothing. But again, that's the nature of the kind of market of it. But let me say a couple things. One is that as someone who does a frequent amount of training in security culture, the first thing you tell, as you noted, the first thing you tell almost anyone in a security culture training is, you know, who you're going to be the most suspicious of. Will be the most suspicious of the person that you know the least, use them that time, and the person that most recently showed up in your community, and the person that most recently tried to establish ties with an activist group. So like, you know, one is that if we're going to have increasingly nomadic ways of life, which I think we are as a human civilization, then we need to think about ways we kind of establish trust. Schneier, S-C-H-I-E-R, who's not a vegan or an anarchist or anything of that ilk, but he's probably one of the most famous security theorists. He does cryptology work. He's like one of those easily findable things online. But he is a good example of someone who really maps trust networks. You know, why public key encryption networks break down, not because of the math, not because of quantum cryptography, but because someone writes the password on the computer and post-it notes there. You know, so he looks at kind of the ways in which social human trust networks lead to breakdown of security. And I think that's important. And so if we're going to have these places where we're moving around, we need to figure out ways to verify and vouch for people that aren't just based on rep. You know, I'm like, yeah, I know that guy. He's that guy. He did that cool thing back in the day. You know, like that's not really helpful for establishing actual. We are attempting to establish webs, networks, which are really dense and really redundant. That's the point, right? Redundant, dense, decentralized networks. But what we're doing is we're not really building that. We're trying to build things that look like this, and we're building things that kind of look like this sometimes. They kind of touch, but really, we're really trying to build that overlap, and I'm not sure we're doing it very well. But yeah, I mean, the adjunct game is pure exploitation. It's straight. The Marxist critique writes itself. I mean, it really is such an easy kind of case study in alienation and recuperation of our labor. But I've been doing it for about another year and a half, and get a job. If not, switch gears, do something else.
I think you also just have to accept that you have to give up some of the things you want to do as an activist. So I am just 100%, people know my name, I publish on stuff. Every campaign I do is 100% above ground. We're like, we can't put it on Facebook, we're not going to do it because we have 2 academics involved in our campaign. And so it would be, a violation of security culture for us to be trying to do any sort of even legal action that requires some amount of secrecy in terms of organizing our strategy. So we, you have to, once you put your name out there, you just sort of, I think you have to give up some things. You have to choose the role that you're going to have. and none of these roles are going to be perfect, but I think that, we choose the life we choose, and academia is not it's a privileged life, but it's not a great life, right? Like, I mean, I have a job I love. I mean, I have a job I just absolutely love. I'm tenure track, the teaching load's hell, but they let me do project-based learning, they let me do social justice-based teaching, and it's really privileged, but I live in the middle of nowhere in hunting culture, and what I've decided is that I'm going to bring in an animal studies class in there, and it's going to be challenging and tough, but that's the thing I'm going to do, the way I'm going to make, and don't get me wrong, I love my school and I love my students, but it's not where I would choose to live, and it's not maybe the lifestyle I would choose to have. But if you're in southern Louisiana, I think the thing that we can do as activists who are also care deeply about social justice and education is find a way to be, I mean, there's so much power in our position as professors, even when we are disadvantaged as adjuncts in the system, to be this force of, as an educator, you don't tell people what to think, but you give them tools to think critically, and you give them ideas they may not have accessed otherwise. So it's just always important to remember that no matter how disenfranchised you are as an educator, you're given the privilege to sit in a room and have an audience, and have an audience of people you wouldn't normally talk to, so they can teach you too. And then just to make that experience like the best it can be, because that is a powerful, powerful form of activism, to teach people to think critically and to give them a seed that says, there's a word called speciesism that you haven't heard of. There's something called repression that you haven't thought of.
Okay, so thank you to each of you for your presentations. They were fantastic. I followed the ATA and AGAG legislation for many years, and last year I just finished my MA, and I was looking at activist repression in Canada, because not much is being talked about in terms of what's happening in Canada. Everything we've learned in any critical animal studies course is always about the US and what's happening here. So I wanted to kind of bring this to Canada and say, like, let's look at some examples here and what's going to happen legislatively in Canada. So just a few months after I finished my MA, we now have anti-terror legislation coming through in Canada called Bill C-51. And it's not identical in any way to the ATA or anything like that, but activists, specifically environmental and animal rights activists, have been labeled as terrorists by CSIS and the RCMP in Canada. So with this legislation now trying to go through, I'm wondering if this is open to all of you, if anyone has any advice for Canadian activists in terms of what to do while this is going through, or what to do once it does go through, if it does.
So one of the older press offices in the Animal Liberation Front press offices was actually in Canada, right? A number of them. And so, like, start interviewing, even those people like that are not like vegan or animal rights or not involved in, like, start interviewing, like, how'd you get repressed? Like, what got you out of the movement? All these things. Build like a story, a narrative, like Rock University. Like when, you know, John Sorson was trying to do organizing, he got pushback. So like, talk about that, like at that campus. Talk about the things that happened at the University of Toronto, the University of Victoria, as well as like you know, Ann Hansen and the guerrilla group that she was involved with, like, and like talk about all these different things that were and are going on. To like, make it a blog, make it like a YouTube or stuff. I think that would get, you know, more attention of building your story and like keeping that story alive. I just think that U.S. people are just like, you know, just like we are. We're U.S. centrics. We're writing about ourselves all the time, and like, you know. But there's a lot of repression in, you know, the UK for a long time. You know, Rock Lee, and like the list goes on. All these other people getting killed and things like that.
I remember at another conference, another one of these conferences that was at Brock, there was some other crazy law coming down at the same time that was basically making it impossible to be a nonprofit if you're doing animal rights work, and that passed, right?
Yeah.
What is the climate around these things there? Is it like just like activists who are in the streets, activists talking about it, or is there a dialogue broader about it?
I don't know. I mean, that legislation did pass. I mean, a lot of the groups in our area like one group that we work with, Niagara Action for Animals, for instance, we do vegan outreach, but we have to pretty much just say that we're a cat rescue organization in order to get charity status so that we can actually get support, right? So I mean, there's definitely pushback at demos like the marine land stuff. There's been major pushback from police over the years. So I mean, stuff like that is consistent, but legislatively there hasn't really been anything other than these, you know, CSIS reports and stuff that nobody really ever hears about.
That seems like the problem, right? Because when I think about AIDA and I came into this movement late, like after all this had gone down, so I don't know any stuff I study, it just looks like small pods of people were caring, and there's some lawyers who care, but they cared after it came down, but it just seems like when I think about the things that are being repressed in the animal rights movement, I think the pro-life movement would really be interested in it because they use the same tactics and strategies, right? So it just, I don't know how to suggest what to do. It just seems like this is something that like people need to be enraged about. And I don't know how to make people care, but it seems like such a huge issue. And like you guys have already been so repressed by making sure that no animal rights organization can even be a charity. They've already like punched you in the face, stomped on you, and gagged you. And there's got like, so I don't know what to say, but it's just, there has to be, you know, AIDA went through because, well, it went through for a million reasons, but the day it was signed into law, like no one was even sitting in the room, like no one even knew it was happening, and like at the very least, like that can't happen again. Like I don't know how to make people care though.
I'll say a couple things just to address the Canada specifically. One is that we know from FBI documents that RCMP and the FBI cooperate specifically in these cases all the time as a matter of standard practice. We know that the Department of State issues guidance to Canadian-based U.S.-owned businesses to protect themselves specifically against animal and environmental extremists, as they call it. Those documents are released, and they're actually very, very interesting, but they're specifically directed to Canada. We know that the Canadian authorities cooperated, specifically again the RCMP, cooperated with U.S. FBI and Customs and Border Patrol, I guess now about 2 years ago, in delivering Rebecca Rubin, who had been living there, one of the kind of big green scare defendants who had kind of fled prosecution and went to Canada. And when she decided to kind of, and whatever that process was, she decided to turn herself in, that she was able to facilitate that between the Canadian border and the U.S. border authorities. And we know that the RCMP and the FBI are cooperating with reports frequently. So whether that speaks to deep organizational embeddedness, I don't think so. But I think what does speak to deep organizational embeddedness is everything we've learned the past 2 years about U.S. surveillance generally has shown that there is no border, at least when the countries are U.S., Canada, England, Israel, Australia. There are no data borders at all in terms of allied nations. So any intelligence the U.S. is collecting illegally and legally is going there, right? So when I send in an email to my neighbor, my physical neighbor, that goes to this server in some island nation and then comes back into the U.S., right? That's going through the same filters as all other metadata and all other bulk data that's being collected by the NSA. So I think that we can assume that the NSA is collecting very, very useful and rich intelligence. We can assume that data is being given to the RCMP. And we can assume that there might as well be no border there. The other thing I would say is that I think Greenland is a really good example. Greenland's an inspiring campaign. So my partner Jennifer's been involved with it for a few years. I was lucky enough to be able to go last year. We'll go this year again. We're the people who bring the small kids. So if you see the two people with 2 children who are both very cool and cute. Those are but anyway, but I think that Greenland is an inspiring example. It really takes some of the shame activism, which was really popular in the 80s, some of the stuff that ACT UP did, and some of the other kind of performative, spectacular street theater stuff, and really puts that back out there. It provides a severe disincentive for people to go, which is kind of the point. People having to take little Johnny and little Sally to see the whale, and now they have to go through this crowd that aren't speaking too highly of it. It's again a campaign-centric, targeted campaign, which is very, very winnable. The last thing I would say in reference to the pro-life movement or the choice movement, or whatever you call it, is that I think that it makes us uneasy, but it's an apt comparison to make, right? I mean, it's an apt comparison and it's totally false comparison. No, it's an apt comparison because the tactics are similar. The attack and the strategies are more similar. It's not an apt comparison because they attempt to and successfully murder people, right? That's the goal of almost all of these sorts of attacks, is that the maim or kill, and that's extremely different than the animal rights movement. But whether or not like the animal rights movement is doing itself a disservice by not being more like the extreme people is a really interesting and complex conversation. But at present, one of the things that I think is important is that in academic literature, I mean like top tier, super professional journals, there's and mostly in the security studies discourse, there's frequent analysis about the connection between anti-choice activism and the availability and surplus labor of medical providers, right? How does people picketing at clinics affect doctors deciding to go into OBGYN, specifically to abortions? That data exists. There's been 4 or 5 articles about it. There have been articles that try to quantifiably gauge the effectiveness through the availability of clinic workers and clinic availability, clinics being open and clinics being closed, right? I wonder why none of that research, outside of Carol, myself, and maybe one other person I could ever think, has ever done this sort of research of any of our movements. There is some valuable insight to be gained by, for instance, doing an analysis of the Shack campaign and saying, here's what we think this movement achieved, and here's what the data shows as far as financial disincentivizing. So why can't we prove this in a transparent way, the way all other fields of academia do? And again, I think that if you want to look for one analog, go to, look at, Routledge-based security journals that talk about the anti-abortion. There's stuff that I really wish, we had. I really wish we had that sort of data. It would be very helpful for us to understand ourselves.
So we have one last question.
I just want to say that I'm from Pennsylvania, across the border, 14 miles in Susquehanna County, and I became an activist with the gas drilling fracking issue, and I'm very appreciative of hearing about the repression that goes on and all this information I'm getting here, because I've been dragged to court now. I'll be 5 times in court. Capital and Gas has sued me, $1 billion company, and they accused me of some similar things like you're talking about, which is the trespassing, being a danger to them. I basically photograph and document what they're doing in the neighborhoods, and I conduct citizen gas tours, showing people from all over the world, all kinds of media, all kinds of citizens to see what they're doing, which the gas industry is hiding, and then show them the harm, those who have lost their water, those who are being exposed to toxins. And we have 41 compressor stations now in my county, 1,100 gas wells, hundreds of miles of high pressure gas pipelines in 6 years. So it's important to understand the demonization that I've also gone through. I have to go to court Thursday now for the 5th time in my county, and they come up with false witnesses even. This was at the last hearing in February. Actual false witnesses, gas workers who lie under oath and say that I'm someplace. I'm under an injunction since 1.5 years ago, which means a restraining order. I have to stay 100 feet away from their driveways and their sites. And so they have workers who are lying under oath, saying I was there, and I have witnesses actually to say that I wasn't. And the judge, who is pro-gas, is actually believing the gas worker. So Thursday, I'm going in for a sentencing, and it could be fines, jail, or legal costs of Cabot Oil and Gas. So I do have more evidence. I'm bringing more witnesses to say I wasn't doing it, wasn't within the 100 feet. So this is the kind of repression that's actually happening to those of us in our communities, and I'm in that community, and basically exposing what is happening so people know. So we're doing it through that method. So I'm very happy to hear about all of this and interested to see what other tactics and strategies. I would especially like to contact stakeholders and shareholders of these companies to let them know that we are being actually harmed. We have dozens of families who cannot use their water. We have replacement water. We have people suffering in our counties and this is 20 counties at least in Pennsylvania, besides throughout the United States and throughout the world. So this is important information. I'm glad you're all involved in this, and your academics and your getting studies. We have lots of universities coming into our county who are doing studies and working on data. And we have all kinds of equipment that we're testing data with and showing that we're being harmed by all kinds of toxins. So I just wanted to share that and let you know what's happening just over the border.
Thank you for your activism.
Thank you.
I think it's great that you'll talk about it too.
And I'm actually going right now, I'm going to have to leave in a little while, but I'm going to a cannabis rally in Scranton, which is an hour south of here at Nag Park. And this will be our first, I believe, Northeast Pennsylvania cannabis and hemp supportive type of rally. And I'll be speaking there, and that's going to be from 1 to 6 today. So that's another thing that's exciting for me at this point.
Great. So yes. That was your thing. Good to see you, Michael.
Good to see you guys too. Okay.
Thank you. One or two territories that are I actually attach my work and but when things like that happen, then I try to talk to him about I got ourselves and stuff like that. when it, started doing in Montreal because we are, he started to do. Yeah, and it started now. This grant started like 2 weeks ago. It was larger, I suppose. Well, it should take 3 hours, but I'll tell you something. And as soon as it starts, they declare it illegal, and then they try to farm on it. Yeah. Let it go. You know, because you don't know about chocolate. I don't know. They are trying to everything. So we are trying to working on all of these things. And you're okay. When I came years ago, it said they had you're okay, right? Okay, good. And for that, if we were just like tipping up the door. You'll figure it out. Because they're resourceful.
Oh, yeah.
It's fun. All right.
I do that too, but I've been here so long that I stop being. I go to work. It's like well, sometimes one just, but
Carol is a very inspiring person.
I lived before I learned state college.
Oh, okay.
One job. It takes money, but so we don't have for underground now.
Like I just like what's happening.
And he has no photographs.
Oh, yeah, I know Karen. They took in some of our rescue horse chickens. In the fall. Yeah, well, I was just going over some basic things about chicken issues that arise in our Oh, I didn't until I did last summer, I worked 40 hours a month, but I still most of that was just like oh, I know. Yeah, so like I didn't want like so strategy. Yeah. But like I do want to one of the true students.
Yeah, I know. She started down.
Yeah, she did. I didn't know that until the recent it's like a terrible area. So
Which area?
chickens. I couldn't remember visiting in the response. I was just like, I was in DC and we were in Maryland. I don't know quite where I was driving.
Yeah, it's amazing. When I was growing up, I thought that's where the beaches are, you know? And now I think, you know, Rehoboth and all the seashore, and now it's like, who would have guessed that, you know, it's like, they have thousands of chicken houses.
But I want to do my thesis is going to be on sanctuary drive and like sanctuaries kind of figuring out how to care because I mean everyone knows that that industry is just like I think for the most part when you go to Cornell and like all of the vet students are also doing like they're impregnating cows and like it's just like it's absolutely sickening and so you kind of desensitize yourself and also don't learn necessarily like late life care for chickens and for other animals like pigs, like how you take their life. So I kind of want to like look at like where sanctuaries are building up on like scientific and like evolutionary knowledge and how I
Well, again, I'm not going to be scared of it. We just had a